Okay, welcome everybody. This is going to be the start of a new series that I'm going to be doing about photography and giving out tips and pretty much everything that I know of up until this point. So what I'm trying to do is, I don't know what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to make YouTube videos. I'm just trying to have fun. Okay, so for today's episode, what we're going to be talking about is proper exposure. And there's three elements that goes into proper exposure. Number one, aperture. Number two, aperture. Number two, ISO. And number three, your shutter speed. So to give you a brief summary of what those three are, I'll go in order. So number one is the aperture, also known as the f-stop. Pretty much what that means is how wide open your actual lens opens up for the light to come in. The lower the number, the wider the aperture, which means more light is coming in. The smaller the number, which means there's less light coming in, which means less light is coming into the lens. The other thing is the ISO. ISO is pretty much the sensitivity to the light that the camera is taking. So the higher the ISO, the more bright that the image will be. The lower the ISO, the darker it'll be. But I'm gonna tell you why you shouldn't really keep things at a high ISO later on in the video. And the last thing that I'm gonna be talking about is your shutter speed and what it's meant for. All right, so proper exposure, pretty much what it comes down into is that you're not trying to make the image too bright, because then once you take it into post, if you try and bring it down, you're gonna realize that you already blew out the highlights, so you lose that detail. And the same thing with underexposing the image. If you get it way too dark, when you try to bump it up, you're gonna lose a lot of details in the image, and you might see a lot of noise and grain in there. So I'm gonna take you guys into Lightroom and explain what I'm talking about. All right, guys, I brought you into Lightroom. This is what I use to edit most of my pictures. So if you look over here, it's gonna show you what kind of lens I used, the aperture that I had it with, which is the f-stop right here, the ISO, which I had set to 100, and the shutter speed, which is at 1 to 1,000th of a second. So I'm gonna explain to you why I did that. What is proper exposure? So like I mentioned earlier, proper exposure is when an image is not too dark, because then when you go to blow it up, you're not going to be able to see the details hidden in the shadows. It's now when it's too high, because then the highlights are blown up, and when you go to darken it, same thing, you're going to lose a lot of detail. The thing with the aperture also is that the wider you open up, yes, the more light you're letting in, but you're focusing on mostly what's directly in front of you or whatever you have in focus. The rest will tend to get like blurred out, which I'll give you another example of. As you can see in this image, how you can see the blurry background, that's because I had a wide aperture, mostly letting the light focus on the main subject, which I had right there, and everything else is going to be out of focus. However, since you do that and you're letting more light come in, you're gonna have to lower your ISO, because if not, your picture's gonna be same thing as I showed you with the exposure. What would happen is if you brought the ISO to, let's say, 300 or 400, you're gonna see it way too bright. So usually for me, what I try and do, no matter what the situation is, it's just for me, so I don't lose any quality of the image. I don't use any information that the actual camera is collecting when it's taking the picture. Is I try and set the ISO to 100. The higher that you bring the ISO, the more sensitivity the lens is to pick up the light. But in doing so, you're forcing the camera to build up grain and noise, which I'll give you an example of. If we go down here, let's say I had the ISO much higher, I would probably end up with an image like this if I was in a dark location. As you can see, this is the noise that I'm talking about. This is what happens when you use a really high ISO. You see the difference? You see the difference. When you have proper exposure, you don't have to compensate a lack of brightness and lose detail because you didn't have it properly exposed. So for example, who the f is calling me? So for shutter speed is another thing that you have to keep watch. The faster the shutter speed, the less light is going to come into the image, which means it'll make it darker. However, the longer the shutter speed, the more motion you can allow. If you had it to 1/20th of a second and the model was moving, you're going to see blur. You're going to see the blur of her moving. To a high shutter stop, no matter how fast the subject is moving, you're going to capture them frozen in place. Okay, so hopefully you guys enjoyed that video. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Give it a like and make sure to follow my Instagram at PedroMena_photography. Yeah.